Time for another New Zealand Aviation Podcast. It is the 7th of November, so the weekend again. Paul Brennan here in Auckland. Martin, you're still under that, what will become a very rare bird.
Yeah, very rare, very soon, which is kind of amazing. Yes, I am still under the A380, which is kind of stuck over the sky of Oxley, very low.
You're going to have to change that out soon because there won't actually be any flying, I would imagine. I see, speaking of Singapore, they've just retired another 8. How many did they have? Was it 10 or 11 or?
Yeah, I thought it was about 12, but I can check that.
Okay. But they're putting away 8, and these, I guess they've already let a few go. Some of the early ones that went to charter work with that Portuguese carrier who are, what was it? iFly, who are
iFly.
Hi-Fly. They're dumping their ones. They've got a couple, haven't they? And they're like airframe number 5 and 6 or something, the early ones.
I think they took 2, but they're only flying 1.
Right. Oh, well, they're cannibalizing the other for parts.
I don't know.
But I was reading not too long ago that they were planning on operating that for quite some time. So this is obviously quite a recent decision that's flipped. I still can't work out why the A380 never worked. I don't know. I mean, am I missing something? Am I sort of kind of dumb or something? It never seemed to be applied to what I always thought it should be applied to. People were flying them in some cases with less capacity than the older 747.
I know that I never understood that. The only people who have made a success at that airline of that aircraft really were Emirates, and they treated it as a high volume. I don't get it. Korean Airlines had less people. I think Lufthansa as well had less people in the early A380s than they had in their 747.
And maybe that was just a failure of imagination or just brutal business. It's probably more likely brutal business, of course, but it seems kind of sad. And I don't know if there's even going to be, if Hi-Fly are losing their one. I mean, what hope is there for the secondary sort of charter or budget travel market to operate those aircraft? There's probably none. So someone's taken a big hit financially, haven't they, in purchasing these things and the write down of value and everything?
They've lost the money, and it looks like, just reading here, it looks like Singapore Airlines all up ordered 30. So they ordered 19 with an options for 6, and then they agreed to take another 5. I'm not sure whether they took that other 5, but so they were putting a lot on that aircraft, and but it's affecting all of the.
Sorry,
it's affecting all of the big planes, right? So as we'll talk about later, the 747's reaching the end of its days. Thai Airways have put all their 747s up for sale. British Airways have retired all their 747s. Qantas is going to do the same thing. The 777X is now going to be 2 years delayed. The first one will be entering service in 2022. There's already talk about this 777X being called an orphan program, right?
What's the further delay? Because they were talking 2021 at the latest. What's happened now?
I think the airlines don't want to pay for them.
Right. So it's ready, but business.
They're delaying the certification. They're pushing everything right back, which probably suits Boeing right now. Boeing have got bigger issues. And as a sign of things to come, and we probably touch on this again later, Air Transat have just launched a flight Montreal to Athens, 7,600 kilometers, nearly it was an 8-hour 40 flight, and they did it in a 199-seat A321 long range.
Incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, we've known that's coming, but there's an example of how you can use that machine. Now, I wonder, if the previous equipment required for that, how much more would that have cost to operate? It would have been like a large wide body twin or something like that. They were big on A310s and planes like that, weren't they? So,
but they would have had to have flown one of their A330s, or they also used to operate 767-300. But you can now do that in a 200-seater, and it'll be cheap. I mean, they'll be making money on that flight. It's got 12 business class seats, 187 regular seats.
Genius.
Easy. Yeah. And 8 hours 40 for nearly 8,000 kilometers. I looked at the flight radar route. It wasn't the shortest route it could have taken. There was a bit of a dog leg in there. What a plane. And you can imagine, as we discussed last week, if Airbus tack another couple of meters on to the wing either side, pretty soon they'll be doing the same thing with a 240-seater and probably even more efficiently once they tune that thing up for long range with a bigger wing. It's astounding where that's going. And I wonder whether it'll all be a mistake, and once this whole COVID thing blows over, which it is.
You feel I can feel that it is.
Once they scrabble to rebuild capacity really quickly, that's going to be interesting, because people keep talking on about the new COVID normal and all this type of thing. Well, once people actually start looking at the data and not panicking, it's been a storm in a teacup.
Yeah, but they're locking down the UK again, and they're arresting people. I watched a video of a fitness center, I think, and they're arresting the woman or giving her a $1,000 or pound fine, and everyone in there £200, and again, the automaton reading out the charges, you can tell them they're just brainwashed zombies. The way they talk. It's all talking points, but you just wonder how this ever happened in these free countries with all this information about all these experts. I mean, there's some conflicting information, but we were just sharing. You shared with me a link to a story which analyzed the various tests that are available, and I mean that information is so enlightening. The the PCR test? Is that what they call it? It's a complete crock for diagnosis. It's absolute crock, and we've been saying for a while. Well, I've been saying, squawking, and I used to have problems with colleagues even bringing this up, that unless you're talking about sickness, ICU admissions, or death, then I don't want to hear from you. You got nothing to tell me. Yet everything, the whole sort of structure of daily life is being operated as if these tests meant anything, and they don't.
Well, the interesting thing about the PCR test, and this is what has never really been explained to anybody's satisfaction, certainly not in easily accessible places.
You mean the media that's into the fear porn?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Well, that's what it is. I mean, let's be honest about it. They do. They churn it out. It's like they're putting pictures of horrible virus-like shapes and the headlines of their story. They freak people out.
So you've got a test, and all tests have a sensitivity value and a specificity value. So the more sensitive a test is, the more likely it is to be
false positive,
not accurate. So I could go into a room of 100 people and say, you've all got breast cancer. So my sensitivity at that point would be 100%. My specificity would be very, very, very low, because if it's a mixed gender room, 50% of them are probably not going to have breast cancer, right? For example. And so you've got the sensitivity and the specificity are often sort of not at odds, but they conflict. So you've got a PCR test, which on a good day is producing per 1,000 people, it's probably going to produce about 60 false positives, right?
60 false positives, yeah.
Right. And let's say you've got 60 cases of COVID in that 1,000. So you'll test everybody. Now the test is not 100% specific. So there'll be 60 people in that 1,000 that have COVID, and it'll probably get 54 to 58 of them, right? But it'll also get 60 people who don't have COVID. So you'll have 120 people who test positive, right? And let's also not forget that the PCR test is capable of amplifying a single instance. If you're running an amplification number, the cycle threshold, as they call it, of 40 to 45, it'll take one instance of a particular combination of nucleotides and proteins and whatever, and amplify that 1,000 billion times. So that's a 1 by 12 zeros, right? So you got one piece of virus in you by the time they run the tests. And it's giving you no indication as to how viable these viral strains are, right? Or these traces of virus are. So the next obvious step would be to then take a blood test out of those positive tests and culture them to see whether you can grow a viable virus. And the way they do that, simply put, is they take some respiratory tract tissue cells, put them in a Petri dish or on a plate, put the blood sample in there and see whether they can generate a virus of various steps. But they're not doing that. They're just not doing it. So you've got 1,000 people, you've now got 60 or 50, 54 to 58 true positives. You've got some people who weren't picked up, they've gone home, and you've got 60 false positives. So you've got 120 people, and that's the headline number. 120 people have been diagnosed with COVID. Well, they've been diagnosed with nothing. They've returned a positive PCR test. Now, it is likely that 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or whatever will exhibit symptoms. But at this stage in the cycle, none of them will go to hospital unless they're old or very frail, right? Okay. But the interesting thing is that as the number of positives, true positives goes down, your false positive rate's going to stay the same.
Yes, that's right.
So if you ramp up testing and you still test 1,000 people, you're still going to get 50 to 60 positive cases, although no one's got it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what's happening now, because the rate of hospital entrance and everything, it's all falling.
It's not corresponding with the number of.
It's not corresponding at all. But what's happening here?
For a while, by the way.
No, it hasn't been. Well, since late May, it actually hasn't been, right? Yeah, late May. So you've got the situation, and the situation is, and this is, I think this is quite obvious. Politicians have worked out that keeping people safe is a vote winner, and no one ever got fired for displaying an abundance of caution, especially when it comes to keeping people safe. And I don't think there's a plot to take over the world or anything. What I think is you're not going to get fired for displaying an abundance of caution, because there's a slight chance that you might be right. And if you're not right, it doesn't matter, because you were displaying an abundance of caution, like a circular argument. But also what's interesting is I think the major distraction here is for God's sake, stop people asking where all our money's gone that we've been spending on these healthcare services. Because every year they spend billions and billions and billions of dollars more on health services. And it turns out they're not actually fit for purpose, because the moment something slightly out of the ordinary comes along, they all fall over. And there was some very interesting, some guy reprinted all the headlines from the 2018-19 flu epidemic that went through Europe. And the headlines were exactly the same. NHS is about to fail, German hospitals overcrowded. And that was a fluke, because what they've done with these billions of dollars is they've added thousands of managers, thousands of administrators, not much clinical staff, and they've actually managed capacity down so that it's always running at roughly 5% below maximum. Because
but why would
that's
you do
how
it?
save money.
Why would you do it that way? Why would you put in more managers? Why would you put in stuff at the soft end, not the sharp end?
Because management theory has said, in order to run an efficient organization, don't waste any money on operational overcapacity. Run the capacity as close to 100% as you can, because that's how you get the value out of it. Ignore the fact that you've added an amazing amount of cost to manage that down. It's amazing. It's the tail wagging the dog. Because the alternative would be to spend the same amount of money but have double the clinical staff and double the amount of hospitals sitting around doing nothing.
Yeah, but that's what they make out that they're doing. This is the thing. They lie. They make out that they're doing that it's also, altruistic and, that we're there to improve the health of people. Turns out it's actually mainly BS.
It is a lot of garbage. And the numbers that Britain used to do the latest lockdown, well, the government had to come out and say, sorry, those numbers are wrong. They were based on false assumptions. An assumption, as I'm very fond of pointing out, just a fancy word for guess, right? And when they showed the graph showing the hospitals overcrowded, there's something like 482 hospitals in the UK. They cherry-picked the 29 hospitals that had the biggest COVID load, right? So-called COVID load. Most of the hospitals have no COVID patients, right? So it's like a third have none. A third have, more than a third have some. And then these 29 are close to capacity in their COVID wards. However, one NHS doctor's come out and said, yeah, but actually only 8% of our patients are COVID related.
8%.
Only 8%.
My God. I mean, it's either...
But they do know that if it got to 10%, though, the system would fall over, because now they are... And this is the question. Well, how can the system fall over? We spend literally billions of dollars every year on a system which can't cope, which somehow employs, I think the NHS employs like 300,000 people. But of course, most of them aren't doctors or
Wouldn't it make more sense to have more expenditure at the sharp end of your hospital infrastructure than having to print trillions of dollars or pounds that your future generations are never going to pay off? The debt's going to be... I mean, well, that makes no sense.
Well, I was speaking to a mate of mine in Germany, and he says that's why the Germans don't go on about protecting actually the NHS employs 1.4 million people.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, 1.4 million, biggest employer in the UK. The German system's slightly different. The German system's highly distributed. So they're not too worried about their hospitals running out of capacity, because if you need something like a keyhole surgery for a hernia, or your knee fixing or something like this, most doctors, there'll either be a local clinic, or a lot of doctors can do small surgeries in their surgery.
Right. Takes the pressure off.
They have little operating theatres, and they're like ingrown toenails, whereas in England, they've centralised the whole thing completely. If you've got an ingrown toenail, you basically have to go to hospital and take up a bed.
Yeah.
Whereas in Germany and many countries in Europe, you just go down the local doctor, they'll do it there in the surgery. So so here you go. 2000 and so 40% roughly of the NHS staff is doctors is 11%. This is 10 years ago. Doctors make up 11%. Total qualified nursing staff is 29%, and the rest of it's all overhead.
Crikey. So more than half the cost of the NHS is for people who don't have any direct health outcome intervention.
Managers and senior managers is 4%. Central functions, e.g. finance, HR, and IT is 9%, or was 9%. Hotel, property, and estates is 5% of the staff. Yeah. Ambulance staff is 1%. Support staff, 26%. So this is all data, and I'm sure it's got worse, but there's your problem, right?
Wow.
And I mean, I understand, in a country like New Zealand, I really do understand that they were petrified that the health service would fall over, because the health service is pretty close to falling over at the best of time, right? It's I mean,
even though they throw hundreds of millions of dollars, well, they say they do they actually spend it? Who knows? Mental health, 300 million. No one even knows what it's spent on.
The problem in New Zealand is you've got a very small population with an awful lot of district health boards, and with massive amount of duplicated functions. Yeah, well, that's I think a willful thing, because that's ticket clipping everywhere, clip, clip, clip. Yes, and in a normal time it works fine, but New Zealand's got the second highest level of hospital transmitted infections in the developed world. Oh, God. Yeah. Just keeps getting better, Martin. Great. Not great, no. Anyway, let's talk about aeroplanes. Yeah. So, but what that means is, okay, let's extrapolate what getting into this testing, and how that drives policy. Now, Air New Zealand stopped, and Qantas too have stopped. Well, I think Air New Zealand across their entire network stopped selling international fares because there's no room at the inn. Literally here, the quarantine hotels or facilities, they are hotels. I guess it's the only way a hotel's going to stay in business right now, is the government designates it a quarantine facility. There's no room, so everything stops, which is not right. It's a big price to pay for families and people who want to get together over Christmas. It's not going to be possible. And again, given the testing regime and the level of 100% false positives compared to actual infections, it seems again like a huge price to pay
for something that's so loose.
Yes, exactly. Given that the test is been essentially, discredited, even by the inventor, and we've discussed this before, the inventor of the test said it was never meant as a test. It was only ever meant as an industrial process to generate samples for us to work on in a laboratory. We never thought of it as a diagnostic device ever, because it can't tell you whether the virus is alive. It can't even tell you whether the virus that you're looking for is complete. All it can do is multiply what it sees as long as it matches what you're looking for.
But that's driving these policies that are so destructive, not only to the industry that we like to talk about, but to people's lives and mental well-being. They're sort of the price that's being paid is too high. And I can tell you, I detect now in the population, no one's talking about COVID. No one cares about the daily updates anymore. No one gives I'm sure some people, the panicked sheep are still worried, but most people are getting on with their daily lives. It's ebbing away. And I think you made a point before we started hit the record button that if the US election flips, and I think there's still, or the Biden becomes the president, they have been amongst the worst scaremongers actually in America. They've tried to use COVID in a very nefarious way to freak people out and change or influence their voting decisions. What's the bet? And you made the point, I agree with you, that we'll hardly hear anything about that if it'll be played, and you can tell that people hardly talk about it now. Never comes up.
Oh, it comes up a bit here. People are still quite scared. I mean, I do know people who are worried. I mean, I do know people that I know of people that wear masks.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the ones that are really freaked out and got minds as weak are the ones driving by themselves in a car with a mask on. I mean, these people they're demented. They really are just demented.
Because the problem is, and this is going to be the issue. So people have stopped dumping on Sweden now because there's incontrovertible evidence that Sweden has worked, right?
Yeah.
It's people go through the numbers ad nauseum and they just say, "Oh, look at Sweden, look at Sweden, look at Sweden," and they certainly the British politicians that were dumping on Sweden all the time, they've given up because it's like they don't even want people to think about Sweden, right? But so Sweden have said that there will be some seasonal bumps, and it is getting into winter, so they expect their hospitals to fill up like they do every year, and actually they're filling up slower than they have in previous years. Mm-hmm. But once the disease is endemic, right, you just wonder how a country like New Zealand, because how does New Zealand say, and this is an interesting question, right? Oh, it's endemic, give up, it's all over. We're opening the borders tomorrow. We might as well. You can't. So you're going to have to slowly wean the public off the fear, and slowly open up the borders. And if New Zealand's had a very slow or quiet flu season prior to this, and has managed to keep the virus not out but pretty much subdued, how are they going to respond if New Zealand has a heavy flu season going into winter next year? They're going to lock down again? Because that's the only logical, consistent response would be, oh my God, flu numbers are picking up faster than usual. Because this has happened in every country that's had a severe lockdown, right? And interestingly enough, the countries that have had the severest lockdowns have experienced the biggest bounce backs. And another interesting thing that's just come out, there's been a paper about the efficacy of mask wearing has been withdrawn by the authors from the journal they submitted it to, because just before they published, they noticed that rates were going up faster in mask-wearing countries than in countries that hadn't insisted on wearing masks. And you just say, how does that work? But they've withdrawn the paper. They say, well, we need more research because our finding is wrong. We wanted to show, well, we thought we were going to show that wearing masks help limit the transition of the disease. And in fact, evidence seems to be pointing to the opposite. And countries that have had, like Czechia, or was it Slovakia? One of the two. I'm still used to them being together. Had a really strict lockdown, and their so-called, not their second wave, it's the endemic phase, has just skyrocketed. And they are experiencing more hospitalizations, because it seems to be what happens is if you lock everyone away for a couple of months and you subdue it somewhat, it bubbles along in the background. And the moment you open up a little bit, all those targets come out and bang, they all get it. And there's very famous epidemiologists, or highly sort of Ionides, there's a few of them. They've all said you cannot stop it. Once it's reached endemic phase, once it's out there in the population bubbling along, you cannot stop it. And the problem is, the first wave wasn't in March when everyone noticed it. The first wave was probably in October, November, the previous year, when a lot of people got it. And then it came out in March and really unfortunately took out those people that were most susceptible.
Well, if the road tolls have been pretty bad over the last few weeks here, Martin, I think we should start limiting driving. I really do.
Well, limiting something. But I do find that interesting, finding that people are saying, by the time you noticed it, and this is what the Swedes have said, by the time we noticed there was a peak, it was too late. It was out there. There's nothing we could have done. And also, interestingly, Sweden has a constitution which basically forbids lockdowns.
Nice one. I thought the Americans had a constitution that allowed freedom of movement and gathering and religious activity, but didn't seem to have too much teeth when it came to it, certainly in some states. Anyway, people know what we think on that, and I'm detecting less and less, way less talk about the COVID thing here. It used to be every single conversation had something to do with COVID, but now not so much. Anyway, some local news. It looks like there's an effort to remove the Milford Sound airport runway. This story from the Otago Daily Times, November 6th. Proposal to remove runway ill-conceived. The Queenstown Lakes Mayor Jim Bolt has blasted a proposal promoted by a governance group he is a member of to remove Milford's fixed-wing runway, calling it ill-conceived. Just reading from that article, Milford Opportunities was floating opportunities to improve and lengthen the visitor experience in Milford before it produced a master plan. One such option was the removal of the runway within the next 3 to 5 years, with helicopter access to remain. The governance group believed that would free up very scarce flat space for other uses, for example, a visitor hub and experience centre and tracks. However, Mr. Bolt, one of 7 members of the governance group, which includes independent chairman Keith Turner, said that was short-term thinking. My view is that fixed-wing operations in there fulfil a worthwhile need, and it won't be too many years before electric aeroplanes for that sort of service will become freely available, and we would lose the runway there to our future peril. I mean, surely you want to have as good an access as possible to that region, and it's expensive to fly in helicopters and bloody noisy too.
Yes, and you'd think they'd be saying, we recognize the economic importance of having an airport here. It's useful for a number of reasons, and let's put our time and effort into encouraging electric aircraft.
Yeah. Which is what Sounds Air are going to be operating, they're saying, at some point soon. Anyway, looking around the airline business, Alaska Airlines retiring 8 A320s, and they're talking about onerous leases. They've got 41 A320s left. They were inherited, weren't they, from Virgin America? Is that right?
Yes. And apparently they're not cancelling the new ones that Virgin ordered, the Neos.
Right, okay. So they know that they're in for something good there. And also they're worried because the MAX is the only alternative, and they're traditionally a 737, or have been for quite a while, airline, right?
And a lot of armchair pundits like us have been saying, the first thing Alaska will do is get rid of all the Airbuses, and it turns out that's looking to be true. They've probably got a bit of excess capacity, so Airbus will go. But tellingly, it doesn't look like they're cancelling the new ones, the A321 and all that type of thing. And there is even talk of them getting the long rangers, so they can start offering a very good coast-to-coast service. So should they ever want to do that. So that's interesting. And then if we're talking about the MAX, Ryanair, big MAX order holder, they were very proud of the fact that they were the launch customer for the MAX 8-200, which is a high-density version of the 8. And it looks like that's going to be delayed for 2 years, which is a bit of a blow. That's due to issues with retrofitting the new flight control software, which I can't imagine is going to take 2 years. But also apparently they've got issues with the overwing exit, the extra overwing exit that needed to be added for certification process. So I think there's 3 reasons. 1, the flight instrumentation. 2, the overwing exit. And 3, Ryanair probably doesn't want to pay for them right now.
Because Michael O'Leary, he's a bit of a tough customer, really, isn't he?
Yes. So that's going to be an issue for them.
Mind you,
Boeing, yeah.
Well, they've got plenty of 737-800s that they can carry on with, and there'll be plenty sitting around deserts if you need to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then Boeing got another issue of the 777 has now been delayed until at least 2022, and the likelihood of a lot of the airlines actually wanting that aircraft is diminishing every day.
Yeah, let's talk about the big aircraft. And the 747 approaching the end as supplier builds final jumbo frames, the Triumph Group. I think they're down to the last 4 set of fuselage components that they fabricate and make. They're going to be rolling out the last one in 2022, and then that will be it. And what, about 1,600, rounding it off, 747s made over the time. But it's kind of, well, it's not difficult to accept, but it does change the world a bit when, I don't know, people of our age, all we've ever known is the 747.
Yeah, and I see Thai Airlines has put all their 747s up for sale.
No one will buy them, though, will they?
No, I don't think so. No, unless they're really good for freighter conversion. But again, I don't know. I'd be surprised because there's going to be a whole lot of 777 classics coming up soon. I mean,
the 300ER, I see Kalita is the launch customer. It's $30 million US per conversion.
Yeah, and that'll be a very capable freighter and a lot cheaper than flying a 747 around. So
you've got the AN-124 if you want a nose opening aircraft in the future. Yeah. You'd think that they'd want to make a few more of them.
Well, there's always talk of Russia reopening up and putting Western engines on, and well, not Russia, the Ukraine bolting a few more together with Western engines and avionics, but never seems to happen. But maybe it will. I can imagine some of the A380s will be, they'd be 2 cargo doors, top and bottom. They'd make an ideal package freighter. Because, get an awful lot of small laptop boxes and Amazon rubbish into the back of one of those. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, speaking of freighters, futures of freighters, I wonder what the US Air Force is going to do when the C-5's done its dash.
That's going to be another 30 years, apparently.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so they really obviously dealt to the wing fatigue problems.
Yeah, and if not, they'd do it again.
Wow. That's like the B-52, eh? It could be like 90 years old by the time they can it. That's just incredible when you think about it.
And that re-engineering program is also going ahead. Well, the program to look into re-engineering them is still going ahead. So, yeah, that will. I mean, I think it's already happened that a grandson of an original B-52 pilot is now a B-52 pilot.
Yeah, and they're predicting great-grandchildren will end up flying them.
Yeah.
So that's one hell of a program, and it's always entertaining to think or to read the origins of the B-52. I think the design was sort of pulled together over a weekend for a sales pitch in a hotel room in, I don't know, Chicago or something like that. And I've seen articles on it, and the little balsa, the guys had to go down to the nearest model shop to buy some balsa so they could make a model to present to the US Air Force of what it might look like. It's quite an interesting story.
They take off back first, eh?
Yeah, quite often, yeah. They sort of levitate, though. I've seen B-52s take off from Nellis, and they do kind of rotate, but yeah, it depends. The interesting thing is watching the crosswind landing in a B-52, because they actually dial the wheels into a particular position, and there's a control in the cockpit where you can, you work out the crosswind factor, and you can actually dial up the right setting for the wheels. So you still. The wheels are pointing straight ahead, but the aircraft's sort of crabbing,
Yeah, so the plane doesn't have to yaw in; it just comes in at an angle and lands. Yeah.
Yeah, and they need those spoilers on the wings, otherwise, the ailerons are ineffective, basically.
They couldn't do a normal crosswind landing because the wings would touch the ground, so they had to do that with a.
And they've got the wingtip wheels too, so interesting configuration. But they didn't hang on for that one for too long. But just to think that these machines can last so long, and the people who designed them and initially produced them are long gone, all of them.
Yeah. No.
Same for the 747.
Yes.
So I think Brian Weigel, who was the co-pilot for the first flight of the 747 and also was involved, I think, with NAC and the early flying, test flying of the 737 before they made a decision back in the 60s. He's still around. I think he's into his 90s now.
Good on him.
I saw someone was putting a book together about him, so I'll be interested to read that. But it must be about the only one or two of them left now. They've all gone. Incredible. Anyway, look, I don't see too much other news around unless you've got anything. SpaceX have launched military satellite. I see that.
GPS for the CIA or whatever.
Like enhanced GPS, right? This is better GPS.
I mean, I think that was their 64th landing. Just nailed it again.
Yeah.
That's getting. It's still amazing. It's getting a bit, never monotonous, but it's regular now. And it looks like serial number 8 of their large booster, the Starship, is getting ready for its 15-kilometer test, where it'll go up to 15 kilometers, sort of belly flop, come down with a glide ratio of like 1.1 to 1. Use the sort of canards and the fins on the back to get itself vertical again, fire a rocket and land on its tail.
I'm looking forward to seeing that.
That's serial number 8, but serial number 9, 10, 11, and 12 are all quite far advanced in the building. So I think 9 and 10 are actually done, and I think 12 is getting ready.
I was watching a podcast the other day, and they were talking about Elon Musk, and a guy was recounting a situation that he remembers, where a friend of his had a quite a sophisticated metal or materials manufacturing company. I think it was in Texas. And it was struggling to stay viable, very specialized, high-end engineering fabrication. And this chap also knew Elon Musk, so he wanted to introduce the two, if I remember the story going, because SpaceX had some need for some very good high-end contractors for the work that they were doing. This is slightly earlier on in the SpaceX thing. So Elon Musk was in town, and the guy suggested to Elon that he meet this person. And I think in about an hour or so, Elon said, yeah, bring him in. So he came in, and within an hour or so after that, Elon had bought his company, just like that. No mucking around, no due diligence, nothing, just bought it. And said, you can carry on doing work for other people. We don't even care. But as long as we get our stuff done. He said his experience, comparing that experience with Musk and SpaceX to some of the deals that he'd been involved in and trying to put together with NASA and government organizations. He said it's just a universe of difference. It would take ages to get anything. Musk was, okay, like it. Okay, pay the man.
Let's do it.
Done. And that company became quite a crucial cog in the machine of producing SpaceX, particularly parts for the rocket engine, which required very high-end engineering, precision engineering. And I think that's in the end what those people are the people who get things done, that make great advancements. And he's talking about the Dragon capsule. All those big companies like Boeing and all the other big major contractors, they're still working on their ideas for capsules and things like that. He's already done it. Plus, it's reusable.
Yes.
They just give it literally a coat of paint, an inspection, it goes back on another Falcon rocket, and it's up again.
It's up again, yeah. Yes.
Of course, the Apollo command modules, they were all onces. They could only do one flight,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And even the new Artemis program, if it doesn't get cancelled, it's all one single use, right?
Yeah.
So the solid rocket boosters, because they're shuttle derived, they might be refurbishable, but for not much less than buying new ones.
Yeah, well, basically, yeah.
And it's billions over budget and years late, and it's just a gravy train. And good to know that the next reusable rocket will be Rocket Lab, the Kiwi company. One of their next rockets, they're going to test recovery, right?
Okay, will that be landing on the pad again or recovery out of the water?
No, I believe the way they're doing that, because it's a much lighter system, is they're going to bring it back, slow it down using the rockets, and then release parachutes, and it's going to be plucked out of the air by a helicopter.
Okay, I'm looking forward to seeing the video of that. Yeah, okay. I suppose if it's a smaller machine, you can kind of do things like that. Hey, let's go to our feature aircraft, I guess, for this episode. We talked about it last week, and I've got the page up here now, so I'll bring it up. And that is the Short Empire flying boat, the Short C-class flying boat. 4 engines, it says here, reading here, monoplane flying boat designed, developed by Short brothers during the 30s to meet requirements of the growing commercial airline sector, particular emphasis upon its usefulness upon the core routes that serve the United Kingdom. It's a classic look, and the aircraft was also used by Qantas and Teal. I think we had a few. In fact, my grandmother flew on one of these Short Empire flying boats from Wellington to Australia pre-war. I think it took 8.5 hours, but their performance isn't too bad. And, that's the first thing I like to do when I go and look at these sort of pages and get the details of specifications. I mean, they had a max speed of 200 miles an hour for the late 30s. That was pretty good. Cruising speed of 165 and a range of 760. So they must have gone, I haven't done too much study into the New Zealand Trans-Tasman operation, but they probably went via like Lord Howe Island or whatever. 20,000 foot service ceiling. Not a bad performer, really.
Well, typical British design of the time, specified to match the routes that they were flying. So that was based on a requirement by Imperial Airways. Imperial Airways, interestingly enough, was the first user of the Speedbird logo, right?
Yes.
Which is still the call sign for British Airways today, Speedbird. And it only existed, it's really interesting that the airline only existed for 15 years and flew just about every passenger plane the Poms made during that time. Planes you'd never even heard of. But they came up with this flying boat. They didn't need the range because when they were flying their major routes, which was basically initially it was Southampton to Durban and Southampton to Sydney. To Durban, they flew all the way in a single aircraft. But to Sydney, they didn't. They used land planes and seaplanes. So it was a long, I think it was 37 legs or something to get to Sydney. It was a mixture of aircraft. So you'd rock up at the Imperial Airways office in London, get on a train to Southampton. Now you had a choice of flying from Southampton when they had the Shorts Empire. You'd fly down to Alexandria and hopscotch all the way down to Australia. And you might do land planes across to Karachi, then pick up another Shorts Empire across, to another part of across India, and pick up another plane here and there. A varied route that took forever. It took 10 days, and there were 3 flights a week. So the S-23 only had a range of 760 miles because none of the legs were longer than about 500 miles. That fitted in perfectly. The Sunderland, upon which was a derivative of that obviously had a much bigger range because it had a completely different mission. So yeah, they could cram it full of fuel and bombs as required. It carried 24 people during the day, 16 people at night. The airline only ever flew about 50,000 people through the 30s. So it just shows you that it wasn't a happening thing for basically anybody.
No.
A fair amount of their capacity was taken up with flying their own crew and specialists around because there was a full crew based at every stop, right? So they had up to 37 stops and the crew was 5 people plus an engineer plus some ground support. So you had 8 or 9 people times 37 for the Australia route, 8 or 9 people times 25 for the Durban route because there were 25 stops there. That's a lot of people, right? So a fair amount of your passengers would have been non-revenue generating. And yeah, the Empire class was an important part, but only really towards the end. Before that, they just flew like sheds around, as we've seen before. They had the Shorts Calcutta, the Shorts the Kent. They looked like they were biplanes with wings, engines between the wings. They didn't have many of those. They had 31 of them of the S-23, and then they had 9 of the S-30, which was exactly the same plane. Well, not exactly the same, but the same airframe with, interestingly enough, slightly less powerful engines, which had a much smaller diameter. And that, along with some other aerodynamic tidying up, meant it was far more efficient. It was faster, could fly further, could carry more weight, even though it actually had less power. So they were learning a lot about aerodynamics by that stage. But by 1939, it was all over. They towards the end, they opened up routes to Hong Kong. They opened up routes to New York, and you could you could fly around the world with Imperial Airways because they did a deal with Pan Am. So you could fly from Southampton to Hong Kong. Then you could pick up the Pan Am Clipper service from Hong Kong to San Francisco, cross the States on Pan Am, and then pick up the Imperial Airways from New York back to Southampton.
Oh, right, yeah.
So it was all go.
Well, I'm showing the picture of the New Zealand. I think New Zealand only had one, ZKAMA. I think that's the aircraft my grandmother flew on back in the day. And I was just looking at the power plants. Bristol Pegasus poppet valve radial engine. We've been talking about sleeve valve. This is poppet valve.
Yeah, so that's an S-23. The S-30 had sleeve valves.
Oh, okay, yeah, which is the later model, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was like 40 horsepower less, the Perseus sleeve valve, than the poppet valve, the Pegasus, and yet more efficient. Yeah, interesting, isn't it?
Because also
not a huge amount of difference in horsepower, though.
No, the sleeve valve engine had slightly lower horsepower, but of course because the top of the piston didn't have to have all the valve gear, it was significantly smaller in diameter.
Yeah.
So a lot less drag.
Yeah, and lighter too, probably, was it?
Yeah, simpler. Well, actually simpler in terms of number of parts. Engineering-wise, an absolute nightmare to get the sleeve valves working properly because they didn't have the machining tolerances required. So there was an awful lot of hand grinding and measuring and all that to get it to work. But once they got that sorted out, the sleeve valve was a very, very efficient engine with far less parts and a lot less wear. I was actually watching a video the other day of a guy who's got who's made a little bench-mounted sleeve valve model aircraft engine, just a single cylinder, just to demonstrate how it worked. And I mean, it was so much more efficient because the valve openings are massive, and just a lot more effective at getting mixture in and exhaust out than a regular valve engine. But the tolerances required to get it to work well were basically not what broke Bristol, but made sure Bristol, they just didn't get the manufacturing efficiencies and the number of finished parts out they would have liked to have.
Here's AMA again on the Waitemata Harbour in Auckland. 42 were built, and the aircraft, here it is again, it's one of the British ones. The aircraft, of course, was well known because it had the short Mayo composite configuration, which was that sort of mini flying boat attached to the top of the wing, which projected its range way more, didn't it? It allowed a sort of capability multiplier there. So the first successful mid-air launch, it was the Mercury, wasn't it? Was the name of it. Was executed, it says here, off the west coast of Ireland while carrying 600-pound mixed cargo and mail payload. It was for mail, wasn't it?
It was only for mail, could only carry 1,000 pounds, got along at 190 miles an hour, was a float plane, so it had to land back on the water. It's a bit of I don't know, it was a very short-term fix, I guess. A tidy-looking little airplane, though. Super, great-looking little plane.
Yeah.
4 engines, so it's weird, but anyway. And Yeah, but the combination could provide a range of over 6,000 kilometers.
Yeah, that first launch carried, it says here, 600 pounds of payload to Montreal, Canada, 2,860 miles in 22 hours, 22 minutes, average speed of only 141 miles per hour. And some of the long distance records, Dundee, Scotland to Orange River, South Africa, 6,045 miles. That's pretty good, isn't it?
That is pretty good.
But always short-lived. But it just showed you that, any, I wouldn't say harebrained concept, because that seemed quite logical if you think about what was available at the time, but they weren't shy in trying things. While we've been talking, I've been playing some good footage because there is good footage around. And if people want to find out more about the aircraft, they can obviously go and look at the wiki information page. It's all there. But the Empire flying boat, I wonder if we'll probably never see flying boats again, will we?
There's a company in Canada, in Kelowna, on the lake. They fly that Mars.
The Mars, yeah.
Well, they've just made some money last summer training up Chinese air crews, because, of course, the Chinese have they've just introduced their flying boat into service. It's now for their maritime patrol, they've got a flying boat, and of course the Japanese, they have their Shinmaya flying boat, which they've just brought out another version of that. So and you've got the Beriev, the Russian one, which is a bomber, and they did come out with a Beriev 200, which would have seated, I think they could have made like 140 passenger version, but they only built a prototype. And the Beriev water bomber, apparently that is also still available as like a 50-seater if you wanted a go around the flying.
I looked over that at the Auckland Air Show back in the 90s. I had a good look over the flying boat, interviewed the crew, went through the whole thing, even watched a flying display.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
They landed on Auckland Harbour when they arrived. Though I remember the tyres being quite threadbare, but apparently that's usual. So.
Tyres, schmires, whatever.
I think we had, actually, it's a funny story. We had an appointment to interview them through their sort of translator guy, PR guy. And so we made this arrangement the day before, I think it was 9:30, we're meeting them at the plane on the ramp, in the display area. And the door was shut, but there were people in there. So I knocked on the door of the flying boat, the Beriev flying boat. And the sort of door opened slightly, and it was the PR guy. And then he sort of went, one moment. And he shut the door again, and you hear all this banging and rustling around inside. And then the door opens again, and come in, there's a pilot there. And they all smell of vodka, man.
Yeah.
I tell you, you could smell it, and they must have been just drinking up their glasses. But they went on about an hour later to do a flying display. And I thought, these guys are able to do this. I tell you what, it's a great flying display. They really put it through its paces. And
they were drinking tea.
Yeah, of course. All right. Okay. So let's leave it there. We'll be back in about a week or so. In the meantime, it's Paul Brennan from, the apartment. Used to be the bunker, but it's the apartment in Auckland, and
Martin and Oxley.
See you soon.
Cheers.